I'm going to repeat the question. It's about are we able to track how many clicks happen or how many views are happening on our descriptions?
So the analytics for once we surface those long descriptions, I think that would speak a lot more so to that issue. What I can share with you from other projects in which we've done a pre-post on accessibility being part of the website and then, not being part of the website and then being part of the website, is that you definitely notice an uptick in organic traffic, if for no other reason than pretty much everything you do for accessibility is aligned with SEO, but also because it encourages folks with different abilities to be able to use those, the stickiness goes up from an analytics point of view, because they're able to stay on the site longer as opposed to saying, this doesn't work for me, I'm going to click away.
And we'll be looking forward to when we surface our long description interface for sighted users to look at the in-page analytics to see who's activating that layer. And so that's going to be really fascinating, and we'll share that information.
Yeah.
This is probably the scene and maybe everyone, but do you prefer to have a voice reading it that is a human voice that is recorded, or would you prefer to have a text reader?
Repeat the question. To repeat the question, would you prefer to have a human voice versus a computer voice?
I think those preferences really vary. I've learned a lot about fonts when working with the MCA and the passion that goes into those decisions. And I feel like voice fonts actually is sometimes how they're referred to as is the same as well. You're going to have a lot of variance. Some folks prefer a human voice. If I could have Susan or Anna's voice reading me the web, that would be awesome. However, I tend to listen to a computer at about 1,000 words per minute, 950, 1,000 words per minute, and human voices don't speed up very well. And 1 second. And so to that end, I'll say that there's a functional difference versus an aesthetic. One of the things I've noticed though with these long descriptions, and I sometimes do this as well when just reading for pleasure, is on the MCA's website something happens that does not happen on most other websites, which is I unconsciously begin to slow down my screen reader. And the reason being that as opposed to just information, I really feel like there's a story here. There's a little bit of an aesthetic that is really pleasing. And that leads to, me preferring to kind of have it at a slower speed. One quick other point is that folks who are blind or low vision, when someone who's not used to hearing a screen reader listens to it for the first time, it sounds very jarring. This is a voice from the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very integral part of how one interfaces with technology, so you get used to it. Others may have a different preference and prefer a more human-like voice or a slower speed to consume those descriptions.
I will say though that Chris came up
Microphone.
Sorry.
Came up twice in the workshop. Workshop members asked if we could turn descriptions, let's say in a digital asset management system, into voice because they wanted to use them for mobile applications. And absolutely, you can do that fairly automatically and in voices that are not that screen reader voice.
Great, thank you again. Okay. Our next presenter is Ilya Moskvin from the Indianapolis Museum of Art, speaking on codifying formal analysis, how to describe artworks to a blind audience using data. Ilya.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. This is my first MCN, so go easy on me. So I'd like to start off by asking a couple of questions. I feel like I should be upfront. I'm coming from an art history and archaeology background, so I'm carrying my own biases into this. That I became very acutely aware of after MCA's presentation. I'd like to know who here has a programming background? Okay, naturally, that's pretty good. Who here has an art historical background? That's awesome, all right. And who here is a curator? Unsurprising, okay. So this is going to be a review for a lot of you. But I'm really happy to hear that we have a mix of both disciplines and backgrounds here. So thank you for humoring me on that. The aim of this presentation is to introduce a topic which, as far as I know, has not thus far been discussed all that much at this conference, at least not directly. and to provide several directions for future research and development. Generally speaking, I highly encourage collaboration and a two-way dialogue between curators and technologists, and I think this precise topic is right at the intersection of that. So, in a nutshell, I am interested in the concept of encoding visual descriptions into a machine-readable format. Doing so opens up a lot of really exciting possibilities, some of which are quite relevant to our present efforts in increasing accessibility. The primary roadblock, I'd say, is that there's not really an existing schema that can hold this sort of data, at least not to a satisfying extent, and I'll get into that a bit later. For instance, we currently have schemas that help classify the subject of an artwork, but not its contents. So you could have something like iconoclast, which talks about what an artwork is about, but it doesn't necessarily talk what the artwork depicts. It's hard to negotiate between the two. We don't really have a way to systematically encode motifs, iconography, style, or composition. We have ontologies, but a lot of the existing schemas we do have tend to take a top-down classification perspective instead of facilitating description from the bottom up. And in general, I'd say we tend to focus too much on types and not enough on attributes. So with this in mind, I'm going to start by talking a bit about the concept of formal analysis, explain what I mean by its codification, and discuss some of the possibilities it offers. So, formal analysis is how visual description is referred to in an art historical studies. The exact definition will vary depending on the author, but I would say in general it is taught as having 4 stages to it. There's description, you have to describe precisely what you see to exacting detail. There's analysis, where you have to interpret, you have to analyze how the different elements of the artwork interact to make a whole. And there is interpretation, where you start to deduce meaning and bring in context into your descriptions. And then there's also judgment, which is sort of the critical part of this. How well did the author achieve the goal that you perceive them to achieve? So, as I alluded to earlier, the ultimate goal of formal analysis is to explain how the parts of an artwork combine to create a whole. And I believe there's a lot of parallels between these levels of formal analyses and the verbal description guidelines that were put forth by the Art Beyond Sight Institute, which the MCA presentation alluded to. And in fact, something that I mentioned in my abstract that I wanted to bring up is that there's a very, very common exercise in art history courses where they pair up students and they have one student look at the artwork and describe it to another student who cannot see it. And then that student, the second student, has to draw the artwork based solely on the verbal description. And I find this exercise quite interesting because I believe there's a certain parallel that we should take inspiration from, in that when you're describing something to someone who cannot see an artwork, it is in certain ways parallel to trying to describe an artwork to a machine. In that there are, we have to record information about the artwork in a machine-readable format, but we also have to keep the semantic links intact in what we are describing. So, very briefly, this brings us to the context, to the concept of codification, and I kind of want to explain what it means in this context. Here, it refers to the process of encoding concepts and mental processes into data models and algorithms, and it's something that we as software developers do all the time. But I think that in order to produce an accurate and meaningful system, we have to ensure that our models reflect existing processes already used by experts in the field, which in this case means art historians. Codification is about making expert, tacit knowledge available to the public. And if we want to encode formal analysis, we have to understand the thought processes behind it. So, with our purposes today, we are concerned primarily with the first 2 levels of formal analysis. We're not interested in judgment and interpretation as much. We just want to describe what we see. Partly that's because I feel like that is already covered a little bit by ontologies, and because we should learn to walk before we run, and because I personally believe that most of that judgment and interpretation should be left to the museum audience. So, the MCA presentation already gave a few examples, so thank you for those who are staying here, but here's a very, very short example of a formal analysis. It's focusing on the first two aspects. I cut out all the parts that were not that. So for the sake of accessibility, I'll go ahead and read it aloud. The picture is of the Alpe shape, which is characterized by a wide mouth and a long strutted handle that reaches up and outward from the belly to above the mouth. Its surface decoration is characterized by circumferential bands of patterned and figural motifs, typical of late geometric period Greek pottery. On its belly, there is a rather prominent frieze band, which features metapiece with abstracted horses and waterfowl figures. The visual focus is the pattern design itself, which is characterized by a gradient in the visual density of its motifs. That's something I wrote. And so before I go on, we can take this a step further. We can, for instance, say that there are 14 bands in total, 7 on the neck, 7 on the body, and then there are 3 solid lines between each band. And we can start going down the list of motifs, sequentially top to bottom. There's a dotted lozenge, there's check, the loose zigzag, inverse double meander, loose zigzag check, precise zigzag, cross-hedge triangles pointing up, cross-hedge triangles pointing down, and so on. We haven't even gotten to like the subject of the metapiece yet, which is that stuff you see in the middle. And we haven't even described the handle, which you cannot see, and how it relates to a certain vase in New York. So this is something that art historians do all the time. I think you guys get the idea. So to sum up what formal analysis is, it is very thorough and it's I almost said exhausting. It's exhaustive, excuse me. You can write pages upon pages of this stuff and you're not gonna be wasting a word. Like there's more and more detail you can go into. Especially once you start digging really deep into things like motifs, iconography, and style, and when you start bringing in comparative material. So a good formal analysis will leave very little left to be described. I guess hearkening back to Stones and Churned. However, if we call back to the interpretation and judgment components, it's important to acknowledge that formal analyses are written towards some purpose, to prove some thesis statement. In the process of writing proof, a writer will prioritize some visual contents over others. And the problem, thus, is kind of twofold. One, if we want to encode this, we have to provide a platform that can mediate between visual descriptions that were tailored towards different purposes. And two, we need to realize our own purposes and our own audiences and to tailor the output of our systems towards those audiences. So in other words, we need to take the most exhaustive description and slim it down appropriately. The trick is figuring out what to summarize and what to cut out entirely. Secondly, formal analysis uses a lot of jargon. Each of the weird words that I just said is like meander, metape, check, you were there. All of these are established terms and concepts in the subfield of Greek geometric pottery. The problem, of course, is that your audience is not going to necessarily have training in Greek geometric pottery. They're not necessarily going to know what these terms mean, and even if they can figure it out, they might not care. So we need to have a system in place that can digest this jargon into something that can be understood by everyone, either by providing definitions or by providing word alternatives, phrasing alternatives that are appropriate to our target reading level. Ontologies of motifs or iconographic elements would be really useful in that regard. Lastly, formal analysis places artworks in a historical context. Now, formal analysis tells a story. That's what's so awesome about it. This can mean bringing in socio-political, economic info, or talking about an artist's life or their influences, but it doesn't have to. Ontologies are really good at connecting people, places, events to artworks. This is a step before that. And you can place an artwork in a historical context while still focusing solely on its formal aspects. You can, for instance, talk about the evolution of the features in the surface decoration and how these motifs identify the picture as belonging to the birdseed painter workshop and how these motifs relate to work attributed to other workshops. Ontologies of stylistic elements would yet again be very helpful in that regard. So at this point, we should probably talk about why we would encode something like this. Why would we encode in something that's machine readable, and what can we do with it? What benefits could it bring? So let's say that we get to a magical time in the future where all of our museum databases are actually connected, and we can search all of them from a centralized place. We can search many collections at once. Given the data that we have right now, we would not be able to offer our visitors a way to search artworks by content. By subject, yes, not by content. Unless those exact terms happen to appear in the metadata or in the notes fields used by curators for their own purposes. Our present systems are just not equipped with dealing with this kind of data systematically. Using a system that's meant for this, that can handle this data, we could determine formal similarities between artworks, which would allow us to offer better related artworks listings, as well as much better search tools. If we push this concept far enough, we could actually automate a lot of the work we have to do to get to that point. We could automate more and more of the description process. We can use computer vision. We can use what you see is what you mean editors, which help you put that data. It looks like it's a natural language, but it's actually a form. And we can use natural language processing to process existing descriptions into a machine-readable format. And eventually, there will come a point when we'll be able to produce tentative automated identification of artworks, both for scholarly purposes and for just visitors casually passing through, which I think is amazing, because there's a lot of private collections out there that are not in museums yet. So I think this is a really good opportunity to get people outside your institution involved in marking up your collection. Art history students become very intimately familiar with the process of formal analysis. They write a lot of papers that get thrown away, and this is a really good way to get them involved in the museum world remotely, to get them interested in data science, in accessibility, and to contribute to museums in a meaningful, long-lasting way. The same could be said for collectors, enthusiasts, and in certain cases, experts from the original communities where from the art originated. I come from an archaeological and indigenous arts background, so that's kind of what I was thinking of. In this respect, it's fairly similar to prior social tagging efforts, such as Steve.Museum and Accurator from the Rijksmuseum. Providing a consistent framework like this is really important to these sorts of projects, because you want to standardize things, you want to provide a way for people to ease into these kinds of descriptions. And I think getting your audiences involved in tagging your collection will give them a sense of ownership, agency, and investment in your institutions. So I know I just skimmed through a lot of potential applications, but there's one in particular that I'd really like to focus on for this session. Natural language generation is a pretty niche topic. It lies somewhere between computational linguistics and machine learning. The basic idea is that once you have all this data in a machine-readable format, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it, a lot of ways you can manipulate it, and automatically or semi-automatically turn it back into natural human language. So what I think is really neat about it is that you can bring in external tools, some of which already exist, and resources to tailor the generated visual descriptions to the needs of your audience. So for instance, you could bring in external ontologies to help define all that jargon. You could tailor the descriptions to specific reading grade levels, adjust word difficulty, adjust level of detail. You could even automatically translate your data from one language to another, but I'll be the first to admit that we will have to do a lot of efforts to translate some of this jargon into other languages. I tried it before, it doesn't work out smoothly. So many of these problems have already been addressed by by language processing researchers and just enthusiasts of natural language processing in general. But the tool sets available today are definitely not plug and play. They're meant for developers. So any software developers out there, we have a lot of work to do if we want to make something like this happen. And I'd like to give a very special shout out to the only group I found who did this kind of thing in museums before. They're from the Philippines, from the De La Salle University, and they did a virtual museum where they combined collections of 3 museums and basically automated descriptions using the metadata they already had. And I invite you to take a look at their paper, Natural Language Generation of Museum Object Descriptions, based on user model. It's really easy to find online. Check it out. It's definitely a start. So to wrap up my presentation, I'd like to touch a bit on the technical details. How should we go about creating a schema for machine-readable visual descriptions? How do we get the data we need, and how do we integrate it into existing systems and practices? Are existing systems sufficient for this task? So this is where I'll freely admit I don't have all the answers. I've been hitting my head against the wall trying to figure this out for the past few years, and it's really, really complicated. The only things that I'm really relatively certain about is that we should probably look to archaeological typology for answers, because they've been working on these problems since at least the 1960s, thinking about how to make descriptions that can be analyzed computatively, that can be manipulated. Some pretty exciting developments in machine learning in the last decade or so as well. And credit where credit is due. I mean, we got CDUX CRM, you know, that's an archaeological endeavor, at least originally. So yeah, we should look at what they've done and what lessons they've learned. Secondly, the schema that we use or produce, it must or it should emulate the structure of natural language. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, descriptions and classifications are formal languages, not too undifferent than the code and databases that you already use. So all these things, they exist in this gray space, and we really need to own this gray space if we want to mediate between the 3. Thirdly, the schema must be recursive at its core. If classifications are a formal language, and if language is recursive, then classifications are also recursive, and so are the descriptions that they require. The classic attribute value model, if we are to use it, must embrace recursion. I found very little publishing on this topic, so maybe this is a new thought, I don't know. But the basic attribute value system is used very widely in all sorts of disciplines. It's a spreadsheet, it's a relational database, you get the idea. Artworks are entities that have attributes which have values. Here's the recursive part. Parts of entities are themselves entities that are describable and classifiable. Attribute value sets, particularly attributes which are categorical, are themselves typologies, and each typology itself constitutes a type. And once you get thinking about this for a while, you just want to kind of lie down. Fourthly, we need to create and integrate ontologies of motifs and iconographic or stylistic elements that can be referenced by the schema. While it is possible to describe artworks without classifying them, and it is in fact politically preferable, classification is unavoidable at some point because this is a recursive process. It's just how we work. So if we can't classify artworks, we have to classify the elements that make them up. Lastly, and I'm hesitant to make any conclusions right now because I definitely need to do more research, but I don't think there's a system suitable for this task as of yet, not ideally. The 2 I looked at so far, and I might be putting my foot in my mouth here, they seem to be meant for different purposes. The CDUX CRM is meant for systems integration, and Lido is meant for data interchange. I don't think it's really meant to be storing this kind of stuff. But if we came up with a schema, I'm pretty sure it can plug in fairly seamlessly into these systems. And out of curiosity, I ran the image that I showed you guys through the Google Cloud Vision API, and it returned the following results. Vase, okay. Ceramic, pottery, pitcher, wood, antique, and flower pot. So these are pretty useless for our visitors and for any scholars passing through. Google is amazing, but it's not anywhere near detailed enough that we need. So I am probably just about out of time, and I'd like to conclude with a few general takeaways. First of all, I'd like to encourage you to encourage a two-way dialogue between curators and technologists at your institutions. I'd like to also encourage you to look outside of your own field for inspiration and to understand the processes and workflows you're trying to model. This goes for everyone, not just technologists. And thirdly, try to automate yourself out of your job. It won't ever happen because there's always more things to do. But I feel like if you get close to it, you're probably doing something right. All right. If you're interested in the topic of encoding visual descriptions, automated classification, or natural language processing, or if you'd like to get involved in this particular project, or if you just want to chat, please email me at iMoskvin@imamuseum.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilya. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. I'd suggest that we do still have two of our presenters from before this on a related topic. So first, if there are questions specifically for Ilya, that would be great. And then we might have a moment for a more general discussion.
I'll just shout across the room. I think this is a really interesting field. I think that obviously, like you said, there's a long way to go. Do you think a better starting point to see results in your future is going to be having human experts exhaustively, classify, like add tags and stuff to a collection that requires a lot of times people with a lot of specialized knowledge, or take an algorithm that's like good enough, have it run through and churn through stuff, use bad data, and then have people correct it?
Well, I feel like you set me up there, but at the same time, I fully agree with the way you set me up. I do think that the first way is better, that you should have experts go through a collection. But you should not have experts go exhaustively through a collection. That is a top-down approach. It has to be bottom-up. You have to get experts who are very passionate about a certain subject, and they want to improve the scholarship on that subject. And you have to encourage them to work on those objects that they want to work on, and give them the tools they need to do so. That's why it needs to be less of a classification, more of a description. Anybody else?
Any thoughts, comments, questions that cut across or tie together the two presentations we just heard, for those of you who were here before?
I'm just curious how this interacts with a digital asset management system where descriptions are being read, and I'm looking at, kind of the other way of machine reading, how to write them so they're machine read rather than turning that into natural language. So the other way, but, is there a way that these descriptions go back to describe for archiving?
Right. So, I haven't thought too much about integrations with dams. The ones that I've worked with personally, their data is okay, for sure, but most of the things that I've seen in them were definitely metadata. Metadata about the life of the object instead of the object itself. And material and things like that excluded. So I might just be a bit ignorant about it, to be honest.
But we are writing narrative descriptions, so we're always looking to repurpose and not reinventing the wheel all the time. So I'm really interested in that intersection.
I think we would have to probably, because this has to be somewhat of a controlled vocabulary situation. Yeah. It's true, but I can't imagine getting the dams on board with something like this off the bat. So it would have to be an external system that then integrates back into the dams and feeds information back. I think it would have to be. But thank you for that information. I wasn't aware of it.
And we're just about out of time, but a quick one from her.
One thought as far as that particularly is keeping in mind that if it's an automated description or you're having somebody describe, are you having them describe the photograph or are you having them describe the object? And if the data is about the photograph, then okay, that goes into the dam. But if it's about the object, is there another authority that's better suited for
This is not a pipe.
Exactly.
Oh, is this one for me or for, because I'm not sure I can answer this one.
But to rephrase, it is, when we are having these descriptions, are we having them describe the output, or are we having them?
Right. That is complicated because especially once you bring computer vision into it, the photograph itself becomes what the computer sees. So then you have questions like that to ask. And I'm not even sure if that's a technical one or an epistemological one. And I'm sorry that's a non-answer.
Yeah, I think it's actually both, and I think it's something we've been grappling with. I think there's both a complication of whether or not you're describing the object or the surrogate. I think there's also this immensely interesting opportunity to if you are doing visual description of multiples, actually for the first time ever, actually apply those descriptions to more than one word, where we wouldn't do that because we think of our voices as really individual. There are cases here where that would actually work. So this is kind of an interesting question, but I don't think it's one that will be resolved immediately. It will have a little to do with what is the raw information that you store and how is it processed, and then how do you store processed information. So in fact, all of those, the questions of where things are stored, how they are analyzed, right, and who is doing which part and in which system, all sort of feed into the question, the answer to the question. So really, that's why I have more questions than answers, but it's kind of an exciting time.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. Lots to talk about, lots to think about, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.